Next up, ladies and gentlemen, we have Rick Hamilton, Global Head of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion at AICPA. Hello, Rick. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hello.
Hi. Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
Great. Rick, from what I understand, having read a couple of articles and listened to a couple of your observations on diversity and inclusion, is that you have long specialized in delivering comprehensive HR solutions, mainly optimizing profitability, streamlining operations. So the big question to start with is why and since when D&I specifically?
That is a long, that could be a long answer. So I'll try to summarize it. I'll say this: growing up as a person of color in the United States and in the South, I am no stranger to various acts of exclusion, to put it mildly. And in that space, I really wanted to have an impact on people's lives on a day-to-day basis. I wanted to be more tangible. I started my career as a tax accountant, and it was just too formulaic, too removed from human interaction and direct human impact. And so I began to really look at what can I do from just a personal self-fulfillment standpoint to create a better workplace and just a better world. And I landed in this space here in diversity, equity, inclusion over 20 years ago, really driving the change that we want to see both within our internal organizations where we live and work every day, but then at the same time making sure that from an investment standpoint in the external communities that we all live in, that we still have that same level of commitment and involvement and impact. So I'm very passionate about making sure that everyone is heard. Everyone has a chance to succeed. I mean, that's all what we're going for in this life, to live the best life that we can manage to put together for ourselves. And in this space, I believe that diversity, equity, and inclusion can really help drive that sense of fulfillment for people, both from a professional standpoint and a personal standpoint.
These days, especially in HR circles, so to say, you can hear that it's more of an HR thing,
Mhm.
D&I in general, and it's a buzzword. It's a fashion. It's a passing fashion, not really a strategic effort at company level. I believe something tells me you disagree with that one.
Yes, I do. However, I understand where that can come from simply because historically, let's be honest, diversity, equity, and inclusion has not received the level of attention that it should have over the past few decades. Given what has transpired in the US for the past summer, which has been a very challenging time period for us, there has been renewed focus on this topic. But you're right, a lot of people are saying, well, this hasn't been large of a focus before. Where is this coming to the forefront now? And the rationale behind it is the simple fact that besides the unrest that we see, and besides the fact that you want to create an environment where all individuals can succeed, the business case has long been established for diversity from the standpoint of all organizations succeed and can thrive when there are more voices at the table. When you have different perspectives and different points of view, there have been numerous studies that have shown and have confirmed that diverse teams provide the better solutions, provide more holistic approaches, and drive profitability. At the same time, if you want to focus on what makes people feel good, you want to be a part of an organization or an association that values everyone, that doesn't have the same profile of person showing up over and over again, that you can see everyone advance, everyone have their fair shake in order to succeed. So understood that while it might seem like a soft topic and people can say, oh, this is something from HR, I would argue that business case has been made, and now the world is showing us that this should have been something of note and importance for a long time. And I'll just digress just a little bit to say, even the old forms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, when it was just called diversity, that was not enough to really establish the changes that we wanted to see. If we did, we wouldn't be having the same conversations in a lot of the areas in the space that we are. So what I'm hopeful for is that now people can see that it is beyond just an HR initiative, that this impacts every single part of the organization and the entire employee life cycle. And that ultimately, at the end of the day, we can drive towards effective change in this space that then at that point we can kind of take a pause and say, we're moving in the right direction. Now let's continue to reassess and move forward as a whole.
At the end of the day, Rick, who should be responsible for cascading that knowledge? As you said, there are studies and there is research talking about the positive impact of diversity on the organization. But I suppose, as we have seen over and over again, there is a lot of skepticism all around. So, how do you prioritize communication around diversity and inclusion being a strategic effort rather than a soft issue?
Yes, absolutely. I think what that really boils down to is a couple of things. One, beyond just the profitability, again, through the studies that has been shown that when you have diverse teams, it drives the best talent. But in that talent space, you want to be able to go out to the market. You want to be able to get the best talent wherever it resides. And you're not going to be able to do that if you don't have a thorough approach where all individuals can not only feel welcomed and included in the organization, but from an equity standpoint, still have the same access and awareness and fairness in order to achieve. I think it's important to remember that when we're looking at these things from an overarching standpoint, that leadership has to be bought in on this piece. They have to really understand this true strategic impact that diversity, equity, and inclusion can have. I think it's really key to remember that as you're going through this, it is a journey. And that's what needs to be reminded to people when you're developing their strategies. These changes aren't going to happen overnight. But it is important to pull it out of just being in HR and to really put this DE&I lens on every aspect of your business. When organizations do that, they see things that they did not see before. They didn't realize that bias could show up in certain places. They didn't realize they were potentially limiting their opportunities when they're going out to market because they're not presenting diverse teams. They didn't realize that they were missing out on a lot of innovation and driving things forward in the new spaces of whatever their industry is because they're not getting those different points of view. So I think ultimately, when we want to try to get this out, you really need to have that leadership commitment and buy-in. That's key. That's kind of the bedrock, to be honest, because they really do drive the culture and tone. But then ultimately, it's up to everyone in the organization to drive diversity, equity, and inclusion forward. Everybody has a stake. Everybody has a seat at the table. Once you get that leadership buy-in and that commitment is secured, then you can really branch out to all of your other internal and external stakeholders and just get your everyday professional to weigh in and give their opinion as to what they feel matters to them in this space.
Having said that, do you think it's a good idea to focus on different dimensions of diversity, age, gender, LGBTQ, color of your skin, these aspects, or is it better to adopt a holistic approach from the start?
Yeah, and I really like that question. And I like that one a lot because I'll go back to what I said earlier. There have been numerous instances and decades of research around what we typically call affinity groups or the, specific groups that bring people into a certain cohort. So just like you said, say for instance, just your LGBTQ cohort or your Black cohort, those very funneled and specific directives. But we've had those things in place for years and they haven't had the impact that we want to see when it comes to really pulling things up and really seeing the change in organizations that we're looking for. So I think that from that perspective, it's good to bring cohorts together for sure, to understand what the shared experiences are, to understand what the challenges are. But then I think from an overarching standpoint, there should be an inclusion council of some sort that brings together everyone that's involved and has been identified by the organization to help work on diversity, equity, and inclusion, to then take that input from those specific cohorts to then drive change from a holistic standpoint. Because let's be honest, things and issues might vary from group to group. However, on the whole, things that the LGBTQ community is asking for, things that the Black community is asking for, that our working parents are asking for, that our veterans are asking for, they're not so skewed, they're not so different that we can't work on these same solutions together that ultimately will benefit everyone within the organization.
Now, The next question that I'm going to ask you, Rig, is probably the toughest one. So prepare yourself mentally
Okay.
for that. And it
All
goes like
right.
this. If we look at different companies, sometimes they need external catalysts to actually accelerate internal processes. And at the end of the day, they choose to focus more on a specific area of diversity and inclusion, be it anti-racism, be it LGBTQ communities. So the question is, what would be the basic steps? I know you can't probably figure out a universal recipe for that, but what would be the tried, given all the research and the studies you've mentioned, the tried and tested first steps a company should take to ensure they actually have a workable, sound policy on D&I of
So
sorts?
to me, yeah, absolutely. And to me, the thing that drives that the most is doing a full, honest, and completely transparent assessment of where your organization is currently with respect to DE&I. It can't be an anecdotal or purely qualitative approach. There needs to be quantitative analysis, and I'm talking about things beyond just demographic representation to say how many whites versus Latinos, et cetera. That stuff that's in your HRIS systems. I'm talking about things from a standpoint of how long does it take people to get promoted? Are we looking at the pay disparities that might exist between gender? Are we looking at the pay disparities that might exist between race? Are we also looking at the opportunities that we're providing to people? How many people of color or how many women are enrolling specifically in our development programs? How many women and people of color or underrepresented groups are we considering in our succession planning? Those few things right there are things that organizations have, but they don't put that DE&I lens on it to take that assessment and say, we really need to take a look at this because our representation, our success rates, how we're retaining people is not where it should be. And you have to be able to have actual measurable data to bring meaningful change in this space. So to me, that is the key. Understanding what your baseline is, being honest with yourself as a association or organization to say, we have room for improvement. We can substantiate
And
where we are, we know where our efforts are, and then from there, we can then start to build out what our strategy is without having to guess. We know what our areas of note are, we know where we should be focusing our attention.
Rick, without even realizing, you're teasing me into asking you even tougher questions. And one of those would be a D&I strategy is not as easily integrated into the pool of other strategy efforts you would find in an organization, more historical, more traditional efforts. For instance, how do you get a management buy-in to a strategy which entails costs, which entails an organization effort? Because if you have a marketing strategy, everyone clearly understands what kind of tangible benefits it almost instantly
Mhm.
translates to. Same goes for HR strategy. The same goes for all types of productivity improvement areas. But here we're dealing with something that is much more sophisticated, much more long term, much more
Mhm.
complex in nature. So the
Right.
question is, how do you quantify that? How do you make it easier to use as arguments to persuade whoever you want to talk to in the organization, if it's lower level employees or if it's top management or middle level management. How do you create the actual messaging to
Mhm.
persuade everyone to understand that this area of strategy is as legitimate as other areas of strategy and can in fact translate into the kinds of benefits that other traditional lines will not offer you?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think that's a tough question at all. I think it's actually really good, as you mentioned, follow up to what I was saying. I think ultimately it still boils down to what kind of employer or organization do you want to be? We all know that there's a limited amount of skill set, there's a limited amount of talent, and there's always competition to really bring out the best and the brightest, to stay innovative, to maintain yourself as a going concern, to maintain your viability as whatever organization you may be in the market. This directly impacts not only your ability to recruit, it impacts your ability to retain and actually develop these individuals because from a standard monetary standpoint, you can look back and say we invested so many dollars in these individuals and yet they still leave. But they're not leaving for reasons that we can readily ascertain from their exit interviews or their time of their departure. what it boils down to is that what kind of environment are we creating? How do we not only bring in the best and the brightest, but how do we nurture them? How do we make sure that we are giving them more than just their profession, but they are feeling fulfilled in all aspects of their career? And that's where it really does boil down to, again, moving away from just this person said or we've heard these things. Like I mentioned, there's a lot of data that organizations already have. They just took the time to put two and two together to say, you know what, we have a lot of this particular group that is leaving. We don't understand why. Let's look at their time to promotion. Let's look at their pay. Let's look at the development opportunities that we give them, even down to departmental levels. Who gets the stretch assignments? How do they get exposure to leadership? Those are the questions that need to be asked from an equity standpoint and inclusion standpoint to make sure that everyone has the same opportunity. So kind of a long-winded answer, to that question. The demonstrable benefits are there, and they are easier to tie back to a visible and tangible return on investment than you would think. It's just a matter of really coming up with that clear, again, baseline and doing those analytics to pull all of these pieces together to really tell the appropriate story and narrative that then you can bring out to everyone and say, at the end of the day, this is what we're doing to be an employer of choice. This is what we're doing to impact not only our professionals, but our external communities as well. And our DE&I efforts are a significant part of those efforts.
Rick, you mentioned by far the most important starting point in developing a strategy is understanding the status quo in depth, measuring what it is you need to measure to start with in order to develop a long-term strategy. Can we focus on those KPIs a little more? You mentioned a couple of examples, but what would be the core focus area when you start a survey, when you start a study of an organization?
So ultimately, if I were to just say, when you want to begin, you want to understand, do people feel fairly treated within their organization? Do people feel as though they have the same access and opportunities across the board? Do people feel as though there's transparency and how decisions are made that impact not only themselves, but their work and their abilities to advance? Do people have the ability to develop and put together their learning plans? Is that the same? From an evaluative standpoint, you also need to ask, how am I being evaluated? Do I feel as though I'm being evaluated fairly? Is the performance management process clear and transparent? Those types of things are really easy ways for organizations to test the waters to see, okay, this is where we can start to see some trends, or this is where we can begin to have a conversation. Because a lot of these other things that I mentioned around, getting into time to promotion or what your well-being statistics look like, that is more advanced in this space. But if someone wanted to start off in building a strategy, those things which they already have the access to and that they can build a narrative around and understand and do that deep dive, that's a good place to start. So again, fairness in the workplace, how they're treated, am I trusted and respected? Does my manager support me? Those types of things will help give a flavor for where you need to be focused in your efforts, at least from an initial starting point. And then that will set you up for greater success because you then understand that baseline that you can use to develop more involved and more sophisticated programming and initiatives.
We've already talked about two types of approaches. Some companies choose to focus more on very specific areas that are perhaps more relevant for those organizations and companies, cultures and ethnic groups, etc. Some companies adopt a more generic, holistic approach. How about policy level? If you have a typical multinational company that develops a global D&I policy, do you expect any major risks from implementation in a specific country? So are global policy easily implementable at local level?
Well, do I anticipate risk? Absolutely. And I think anyone that's involved in this space should keep that in mind. All countries are not the same. All diversity, equity, and inclusion concerns are not the same from one location to the next, from one population to the next. It is completely feasible and possible to have an overarching global standpoint. We want to be equitable, we want to be inclusive, people need to be their authentic selves, etc. However, what that translates to when you break it down to the appropriate local levels and jurisdictions, it might not look the same across the board. And that's fine. That's what is needed because you have to be able and you have to be nimble enough to pivot as necessary to the areas of focus, while of course remaining in line with local jurisdictional laws, of course remaining in line with cultural norms, and at the same time still driving the changes that you want to see within your organization as a whole. So I mean, I like that as a great caveat. Yes, develop a global strategy, but you need to be able to implement it on a local level, taking into consideration the nuances that are really critical and key in those areas that are different from one part of the organization to the next. And it could even be from department to department or all the way from country to country. So it can take a variety of forms, but you have to be savvy enough, cognizant enough, and do the research necessary to understand this is where we can implement this part of the global strategy. This is what equity looks like in this location. This is what equity looks like in this location. That way you have the ability to still be truthful to what you're going for from an organizational perspective while being completely responsive to the on the ground day to day where people are at in their local spheres of influence.
Rick Hamilton, Global Head of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at AICPA. Rick, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for finding the time.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.